So 2 years ago, my husband and I got married in June of 2015. And Jim was talking about hysterical reactions. And there were a number of those at the time. And Fordham did something truly exceptional, which is that Fordham University put out a statement saying, we wish many blessings to Professor Hornbeck and his spouse. And just as a human being, not to mention a theologian, I want to say thank you to the university, everyone from the president on down who's stood with us and supported us in that process. So Jim's book. When I picked up Jim's book, I thought a lot about my 20-year-old self. So I was a junior or a senior at Georgetown. I was just on the verge of coming out. I was very actively involved in campus ministry, in the life of the Jesuit community. There was a period when I was discerning the possibility of a vocation to the Jesuits. And I think as a 20-year-old, I would have loved this book. I think I would have taken this book and I would have said yes. Respect, compassion, sensitivity. Both of these parties, the institutional church and the LGBT community, need to offer those gifts to one another. And I think I would have been particularly moved by Jim's suggestion that what needs to happen on the part of the LGBT community is to give the institutional church the gift of time. It's a really, really beautiful metaphor that Jim uses. I think the downside, though, is that it's potentially quite dangerous. Because we have to ask the question, what is the cost to the members of the LGBT community to give the gift of time? So people who are here know that suicide rates among LGBT teens are 3 to 4 times higher than non-LGBT teens. People here know that in states and in jurisdictions where there are not laws that protect LGBT people from firing, for instance, or otherwise, the incidence of mental health disorders is about 5 times higher. And so I think in the weighing up of these issues, we have to ask ourselves, what is the cost of the gift of time? And I say that with the deepest amount of respect for people who have decided that they are Catholics, that they are standing in their church, that whatever might be said by people who claim to speak for that church, that they're going to claim their home. And I think those people give us an incredible model of loyalty and perseverance and commitment. But I don't think that's the full story. One of the great gifts I've had here at Fordham is the opportunity to spend some time with our foreign exchange partners in South Africa. And in South Africa, as many of you know, they are currently at in the middle of 2 or 3 decades of reconciliation after apartheid. One of their great leaders, Desmond Tutu, the Archbishop of Cape Town, he said, it's only an honest confrontation with reality that can bring about real healing. That if we have only superficial reconciliation, we can only have superficial healing. And so the thing that I think we have to deal with in this conversation isn't just respect and compassion and sensitivity, even though those are the starting points. What we have to do is ask the deeper theological question, and as Natalia was saying, what is it that the institutional church is saying about LGBT people? About LGBT lives, right? And if it is right, what follows from that? And if it's not right, what follows from that? So part of that dialogue in truth is figuring out what this teaching does to folks. And that's something I'm really excited to talk about here as well. So thank you all very, very much again for coming. Right? So when an LGBT person comes and sits in a church space, the presuppositions, the theological presuppositions that are at work in that space include the idea that their attractions are objectively disordered. It includes the position that the institutional church has taken that just discrimination is possible. In fact, that just discrimination is required by society between LGBT people and heterosexual people. They have to take the threat of being fired. Going into that conversation with the principal, even coming out, there's a danger. And so there's a whole long list of things we could think about. I remember an article back almost a decade ago called "What Should the Gay Catholic Do?" And in the article, it's laid out a list of things that you can't do if you're a gay Catholic and you want to live in connection with church teaching. So you can't engage in romantic love. You can't get married, you can't adopt, you can't enter the seminary, you can't work openly in a Catholic institution. And since Jim wrote that article back in 2009, one of the things that I think we need to engage in, when is it worth being paid?
When is worth being
paid? Like, when is it worth paying that price in order to engage in that?
And I would like to say, you know, I think that depends on the individual, because I also do not want to undercut the value of, which I say in the book, prophecy and prophetic action. You know, interestingly, I would suggest, though, and this, I don't mean to step on your moderator's shoes.
Don't worry, I'll let you know.
I sometimes think, and I'm curious to know what you think, Patrick, and Natalia as well. I sometimes think that in discussions about this topic, that is LGBT Catholics and the Church and the Catechism, that LGBT Catholics are more centered, educated, and experienced than some of the church leaders to whom they're talking. And so in a sense, they are more comfortable with this. What do you think about that?
I think you're absolutely right. I think we have to ask the question, why is that the case?
Right.
Because the reason that LGBT Catholics have to learn where the boundaries are, what's permitted and what's not permitted, is precisely because the cost of transgressing those boundaries can be so high. And so I imagine all three of us up here on the stage have engaged over the years in some sort of informal conversations with LGBT Catholics. I know you've written about it in the book. I mean, we all do, especially those of us who are teachers. And I remember a year ago, someone coming to me who teaches in a Catholic high school, was thinking about getting married to his maybe by now husband. And the question was, do I need to look for another job? And so it's only when you're in a situation of potentially losing your livelihood, potentially in a situation of losing the respect of your community, potentially being in a situation, Jim, you have some wonderful stories. Actually, they're horrific stories of, will I be anointed when I'm dying? And so in that situation, the LGBT Catholic has to learn the rules as a survival strategy. And so while I think we should praise that, why I think we should say that's a good thing, we also have to remember that the darker piece of it is it's because we have to.
Yeah, I think what we're talking about here is the sort of price that's paid inadvertently by anyone who's in a marginalized community, right? When you live on the margin is your business.
Absolutely.
And you know exactly where the line is, and you know which parts of it are alarmed, and which parts have barbed wire, and where you really have sort of danger zones. So one of the reasons, I think, for this overwhelming, sense of marginalization among LGBT Catholics is the language of the Catechism. Now, let me preface this by saying that we are lay theologians with tenure. And because of that, weirdly, and also because I'm a lay person in the Roman Catholic Church and a woman, nobody cares what I say. So there's good and bad in that, as you probably know. I can say whatever I want, and to a lot of extent, Patrick can say whatever he wants, because we speak for ourselves and our intellectual endeavors, whereas Jim does not have that freedom. And we should I am very aware of that as we're up here, that Jim is a Jesuit and speaks from that place in a collar right now in public. So
at a Jesuit university.
At a Jesuit university. Nevertheless, right, one suggestion that you make in your text that I think that was very moving for me is this idea that perhaps the church might think about in terms of its building, its half of the bridge, or its part of the bridge, moving beyond the language of intrinsic disorder. What prompted you to put that in the book? And what do you think, if you feel comfortable,
of course,
what do you think would happen if some linguistic change were to come about?
That's a great question. Why did I put that in my book? Because as I unpack these virtues of respect, compassion, and sensitivity, which I don't really know, they came from the Catechism. I wonder if the person who dashed that off once knew that I was going to be unpacking them like this. But sensitivity means being sensitive to a person's feelings. That also means being sensitive to the language that you use. And there is no There is no other phrase, as far as I know, other than objectively disordered and intrinsically disordered, which refers to alternately, depending on what you're reading, the sexual orientation, the sexual act that has made people, LGBT people, feel so marginalized, so less than, so subhuman, so subhuman. I was at a, one of the reasons I'm doing this revision is that since I've been talking about this, people have come up to me, and this woman came up to me who was the mother of a gay boy, and she said, quote, "Do they understand what that kind of language could do to a 14-year-old boy?" I'll never forget this. This was just a couple weeks ago, and she said, "It can destroy him." So, several bishops I was happy to see at the Synod of Bishops on the Family, which was 2015 to 2016, suggested this.
That's not even your idea.
Correct. It was not my idea. I fob it off on other bishops. Because what was Pope Francis doing? One of the ways that he organized that synod, which really was on the human family, but of course raised all sorts of questions on sexuality, which I think is Francis's clever way of people like, oh, the family, that's a nice thing to talk about, but it's divorce or remarry Catholics, it's homosexuality, it's all those kinds of things. He sent out a request to have surveys taken and to have the bishops really listen. And I think, bishops really did listen, and they brought those concerns, including the concerns of their LGBT, parishioners and Catholics, to the Synod. And so several of the bishops said, we need to start thinking about setting that kind of language aside. And I think that certainly that language, which is highly, I'm sure it'll explain, highly philosophical and theological. People say, well, it doesn't mean it. Nonetheless, it is extremely damaging. It is needlessly hurtful, and I think it's time for at least an updating of it. I met an Italian theologian, a young theologian, who talked about, for example, like an intermediary step would be differently ordered. That LGBT people are just sort of different in their sort of affections, of course. But I would say that if the Catholic Church really wants to be serious about speaking to people, they have to be attentive to the language they use. And one more brief thing. When Jesus spoke to the people of his time, he physically went to where they were. So he goes from, we read in the Gospel today, he goes from Nazareth to Capernaum to call Peter and Andrew and James and John. He literally goes to where they are. And then when he's there, the call, right, from Luke chapter 5, how does he speak to them? We tend to forget this. He is a carpenter from Nazareth. He has spent 30 years as a carpenter. Does he say, we might laugh, let us lay the foundations of God's reign? I'm glad you laughed. That's what a carpenter would say. That's a carpenter's language. Does he say, let us sand down the rough edges of humanity? Yeah, you only laugh because that's not what we read in the Bible every other Sunday. Does he say, let us construct God's house? No, he says to the two fishermen on the Sea of Galilee, come after me and I will make you fish for people. He's speaking to them in their language, and he does a miracle in front of Luke that is about what? Fish. Even his actions are conformed to them. So if the church wants to really speak to and welcome LGBT people, it must be attentive to the language in the catechism. And I can think of no other two words that are as fraught with people and that they're fraught for people and that can destroy people. And so we need not only to speak their language theologically and philosophically, but we need to be attentive to how that language is, to use a theological term, received. So that's why I put it in there, and that's why I invite the institutional church to reflect on particularly those two words.
So, fellow theologian, at the Second Vatican Council, we know there was a big fight over the word choice between est, right, the kingdom of God, est.
You're doing the Latin.
Yes, that's Latin. Where the kingdom of God is the Catholic Church, or the kingdom of God subsisted, right? Subsists in the Catholic Church. And it was a knockdown, drag out, and eventually, it really was, and eventually we settled, or the bishops settled on subsists in, which was a change. a linguistic change that happens in the church, whether we admit it or not. So, do you have any suggestions for what the linguistic change might be and what sort of ripple effects that might have?
See, this is why it's helpful to study heresy and orthodoxy. So one of the things I want to reflect on is I think everything that Jim just said is exactly right. The language of intrinsic disorder and the notion that certain acts are objectively disordered, these are incredibly painful words. In the book you call them needlessly cruel. I think that's entirely right. So I'm going to put on my theologian hat since Natalia invited me to, and I hope you all stick with me for like 2 minutes. So this is the simple tour through Thomas Aquinas. So this language of order and disorder comes from Thomas Aquinas. He gets it from Aristotle originally. And the notion of being ordered basically means that something is aiming at some particular end, right? So it's what we would think of today as natural law reasoning. I hear with my ear, the ear is set up for hearing. The ear is not set up for eating. If I try to eat with my ear, that's not going to work out so well. If I try to hear with my mouth, that's not going to work out so well. So things are ordered to their particular end. That's where the language comes from. So we can move out of the frame of hearing and eating into the realm of sexuality. And the Catholic Church's teaching with regard to sexuality, and not just on LGBT issues, is that heterosexual sex within marriage, which is ordered to two things, procreation of children and the unity of the couple, can be morally good. And all other forms of sexual activity ordered to those two things are intrinsically bad. So that's where we get the language of intrinsic disorder from, we being the catechism and the institutional church. It's a way of articulating philosophically the idea that these particular types of activities are not ordered to the end for which God created human sexuality. And of course, you all don't need me to point out that this is what's at the bedrock of intra-Catholic debates about contraception as well, right? Because the idea is you have to have both the possibility for procreation and the possibility of greater unity within the couple. So that's what the teaching is. And it's on the basis of that teaching that the church has been able to say, well, we can justly discriminate between those who are engaged in this type of sexual activity, which is rightly ordered, or is usually, or can be rightly ordered. Not all heterosexual sex is, of course, rightly ordered in this view. So we can discriminate between that on the one hand and same-sex sexual activity, which by its very nature is not rightly ordered, right? So that's where this language comes from, and it's so important to understand the history of that because it plays into this question about linguistics. So when Jim says the language is needlessly cruel, and we need to think about maybe coming up with some other language to do so, my question, I'd love to hear, Jim, what you have to say about this, is it that we take that teaching and we just say it nicer? Or is the idea that this notion of differently ordered would actually revise our understanding of what sexuality is ordered to in the beginning? Because those are two really different kinds of things. One of them might be expressing welcome in a way that maybe would persuade more people to be part of the church, to be engaged in the church, even though they understand that they're still being told that their sexuality is not rightly ordered. Or is it that we actually have to change our concept of human sexuality? And that is the issue, Natalia. That's the theological issue that's right there.
Yeah. No, it really is. I think it's the elephant in the room. It's where we're going next. Sorry, Jim. Is the notion of sexuality, right? I teach a sexuality course at Manhattan College, and we talk a fair amount about this. Jim, you've been critiqued by everybody for either not talking enough about sex or not talking enough about chastity.
Right.
Nobody seems happy with the amount of sex in the book. Why did not you say more things about sex?
Why did I not say? Actually, I would say that for many LGBT people, as both of you know, that question is decided, right? And so many people who I meet, particularly I've done most of the talks in parishes, that doesn't bother them. Yeah, I mean they're happy. And this is not. I'm repeating what people said to me. They're happy just that the discussion is being started, and they're particularly happy that a priest is standing up and saying, "Let's start the conversation." So that's usually the response I get. The chastity stuff. I get from some in the LGBT community, not all, that you should have come out in favor of same-sex marriage and same-sex relations, basically. From some I would say on the traditionalist Catholics, it's you didn't talk enough about chastity. But my responses, which was intentional in the book, was that this is not a book on moral theology because I'm not a moral theologian. That's the primary reason that I didn't write about it. It is not a book on moral theology. It really is an invitation to dialogue. So I intentionally left out chastity. And the other thing is, I feel that many LGBT issues are always about chastity. And the main critique I'm getting is the book was not about that. And second of all, they know it already. There is no sentient adult LGBT Catholic who does not understand and know the church is teaching on chastity. And so that's one of the reasons I left it out. And such that if we were talking to a group of married people, again, we would not be saying, all right, now how many of you practice birth control? How many of you are cheating on your wives? How many of you are divorced and remarried? How many of you lived together before you were married? And so there's this kind of, from the right, this relentless focus on chastity, sexuality, and I wanted to actually move away from that and to say a person can walk into a room who's an LGBT person and be treated like a person without the priest or the bishop or the sister saying, are you having sex? Because they are more than that. That's part of their lives, certainly, and that is the elephant in the room. But I intentionally left that out in order to start this dialogue. And again, there are certain things that I can talk about and can't talk about in terms of my being a priest and a Jesuit, but also in terms of my expertise,
And what you mentioned about Aquinas and the notion of being ordered is pulling out this idea of intrinsically or objectively disordered going to unravel a lot more than the church has bargained for?
I think that's a great question. So I actually think, the elephant is sex, and I wanted to put it on the table because there's more to this question than just that. So let's talk about relationships, right? So I've only been married for 2.5 years, but I'm coming to learn that there's a lot more to marriage than sex, right? Like we've all learned that. And the reason I say that is that in the focus on the specific morality of specific sexual acts, and Natalia was someone who really taught me this, that in the Catholic Church, when we talk about sexual ethics, it's one of the few places where we talk about an act-based morality, rather than thinking about sort of a broad sort of orientational morality or dispositional. Relational is a better word than that. And so it seems to me that what the teaching on the morality of LGBT lives and orientations is about isn't just the morality of what particular sex acts people might get up to, but more about and so what I think is actually a far greater tragedy than the ban and the language of intrinsic disorder about same-sex relations is the notion that relationships can't be life-giving. And so one of the things that's been most sad to me as I look at these various Vatican documents and even the USCCB's documents, in 2005, the Vatican, as you may know, put out an instruction through the Congregation for Catholic Education saying that gay men should not apply to or be accepted into seminaries. And the reason for this is really interesting because it's not a fear that these gay men will be less true to their vows than heterosexual men would be. It's that they're in a state of affective immaturity that hinders them from relating well to both men and women. So it's about relationships far more than it's about sex. Then the other piece too, I read Supreme Court decisions for fun. I'm a real geek. And I went back, actually I was just thinking about it this morning. The US bishops filed what's called an amicus brief in the Obergefell decision 2 years ago. And an amicus brief, for those of you who are not sort of legal people, is when a court is hearing a case, you can come to the court and say, I have some vested interest in this. I'd like to advise you that you rule this way or that way. And so what the bishops say in their amicus brief for Obergefell is that it is just to discriminate between opposite-sex couples and same-sex couples because we should treat different things differently. That is their exact line. that we should treat different things differently. And so it's the quality of the relationships, even before we get into talking about the elephant in the room, that's really important. Is it possible for two men or two women to have a loving relationship that reveals the reign of God? And that is where the real sadness lies. It's not necessarily, and we can have all sorts of really interesting debates about when sex is good and bad. I do promise, I do really want to answer your question. But I want to focus on this relational component, because that's a place where even when people might disagree on matters of sexual morality, we can surely agree that people can show and receive love, can grow. I know in my experience of marriage, I've become a far better human being because of my husband. And so we have to name that. We have to say that as a reality.
Can I respond to that?
Sure.
'Cause I love the way you say a relationship that reveals the reign of God. That's so beautiful. And I actually am much more comfortable talking about love. And I want to come back to something you said, because I thought it was very insightful. All of what you're saying is very insightful. I have a friend whose name is Mark, who might be watching. Hi, Mark. Who was a member of a religious order for quite a bit. I'd say about 7 or 8 years. And he left his order, not the Jesuits, and he is a gay man. He came out. I knew him actually in Africa, so that's a very nice carving, by the way. We used to sell them in Africa. And he came out and has been with his partner for 20 years, his partner Craig. And his partner has a fairly serious illness that is sometimes extremely serious and requires a lot of attention. Mark has cared for him for, I think, 15, 20 years now. And one of the questions I would like the church, the institutional church, to reflect on is your deeper question. Is this not love? And I do not understand how a person could say the following things. This is not love. This is a lesser love. They should be apart. They should have never met. They should never be together. So I'm more comfortable talking about love. The second example is even more unusual, I would say. St. Cecilia's Parish in Boston, which is a very, very LGBT-friendly parish. And a couple came up to me, and I apologize if I use, particularly in New York and at Fordham, if I use the wrong terminology. I'm kind of new to a lot of this terminology. So a couple came up to me, and there was a transgender woman, right, a woman who had been born as a man, who had transitioned. And I think you would say a cisgender woman, a woman who, I hope this is the right way to say it, a woman who was born a woman and is still a woman, okay? So they came up to me, very nice couple, and I'll share something with you. My approach to people who might feel like they're in the margins of the church is to go the extra mile, to really try to make them feel welcome. And so we were talking, and she said to me, as I recall, well, we've been married for, whatever, 20 years. And I'm always very careful about not offending. And I said, oh, I'm sorry, I'm a little confused. Wasn't same-sex marriage only legal recently? And she said, the cisgender woman, oh no, I married her when she was a man. And I said to the very first question that came, honest to God, the first question that came to my mind was, what can the church learn from them about fidelity? And so these are the kinds of questions that I think we need to be at. And this is why I don't think we're even near the theological questions, because the institutional church has not even asked those questions because they don't know those people. And one of the reasons they don't know those people is because those people, I don't say those people, people like that wonderful couple don't feel comfortable, speaking about that.
Can I jump in real quick on this?
Please do.
So there was something that Jim said that I thought was really, really important, which is you said that the bishops of the institutional church haven't asked these questions with regard to, say, this couple from St. Cecilia's and so on and so forth. And you're right. And yet there's a paradox, because the bishops in the institutional church have also answered those questions. So let me just step back as someone who on a sort of sociological and theological level, studies the LGBT Catholic experience. So we had a conference here a few years ago, and there was a Catholic trans woman who was there, And she recorded that when she described her situation to church authorities, the answer was given that she had engaged in a form of mutilation. The official teaching hardly addresses the trans experience, but to the extent that it does, it treats it as a form of self-mutilation. Then, on top of that, we have to deal with the fact that this couple, who would now be a female-female couple, their marriage is described as effectively being without value, that the church has stood in the public square against their marriage, whether or not they're Catholic. And that's a piece we haven't gotten to talk about yet.
You know, I feel that each individual is called into the church at their baptism, not only for their own spiritual growth, but also for the church. And so I think the church at St. Cecilia's in Boston, in the Archdiocese, in the United States, in the world, would be poorer without that couple.
Mm-hmm.
And so, in a sense, that's why they stay. Now, that's a burden to place on people, because it's saying you have a call and a responsibility. But and I'm just going to confess something. I have a hard time with, you know, why should I stay? Because for me, the answer is, this is your home, this is your family. Jesus Christ called you into this. And so to trust that you have a role to play that could be life-changing.
And so I think what we're being called to here is sort of a broader, more capacious, more complex, and a more ambiguous understanding of these things, which is what makes a lot of people nervous.
It does. And that makes me sad, actually, because I continually come back to my friend Mark and his husband. And I continually say, and maybe this is a failure of mine to imagine someone else, maybe it's arrogant, but I have a hard time imagining how even the most traditionalist, homophobic, closed-minded Catholic cannot look at my friend and say, that is a loving act, and that is a form of love that I don't understand, but that I have to reverence. That is, and maybe that's why it's hard for me to kind of respond to some of these critics, because I don't understand that. That is maybe a failure in my imagination to understand how people cannot see that.
Right. No, I think you're right.
And that goes back in a very serious way to the issue that Jim raised a few minutes ago. There are a number of people in this room that I have had the great privilege of getting to know as friends and colleagues who have made a really tough, really principled decision that, as you put it, they're not going to be forced out of their own church, that they belong, and that no matter what is said, they are home. And I have all the respect in the world for people who make that decision. I will confess in my own life to not being able to persevere in that particular way. So I was received into the Episcopal Church a couple of years ago. In part, that's because my husband is discerning the priesthood in the Episcopal Church, and it's a helpful thing when the whole family can go to church together and get married in church and all of those sorts of things. And the reason that there's not a day that goes by that I don't mourn being a Catholic in some serious way. And one of the reasons that I spend my time at a Catholic university and a Jesuit university is because I have such deep reverence for the Catholic tradition, for the charism of the Society of Jesus. And I discovered that I was a better person, better able to do this work when my own spiritual community would look at me and say, we accept you as a whole person. Christian church, which in the first century was able to be that beacon of hope, much as it had many, many problems still in the first century, can't do that on this issue in the 21st century. Unless we have a real confrontation with reality, we're not going to find real healing. If we have only a superficial reconciliation, we're only going to have superficial healing. And so one of the takeaways that I've gotten from this conversation is at the bottom of all of the topics that we've talked about is our dear friend Thomas Aquinas, and behind him our other dear friend Aristotle. That teaching, which is to say that LGBT attractions and loves are less than because they are disordered, is the thing that underlies the arguments about just discrimination. It's the reason for the arguments about why parishes can't have the kinds of ministries that they want to have. And so Jim has begun this conversation. He's offered us this invitation to dialogue. But if this is going to be a dialogue, we have to get to the next level, not just how do we relate to each other and how do we listen to each other. But the question is, what is true? what is right and what is good. And I believe the truth will set us free.